Hopefully I'll get going then. In true style, I actually asked to be late, the latest slot in this wonderful programme. Due to me being ADHD, I kind of found out just over a decade ago that I'd got traits and characteristics, and those actually heightened when I had my first child as a mother. And I actually found myself in a predicament of actually wanting to explore the characteristics of ADHD a lot more. However, my history of supporting students with neurodiversity goes way back and beyond to kind of the mid-2000s, when I was a learning advisor, learning disability advisor in a university. I've worked in FE colleges. I've managed a 60 plus team of disability advisors, tutors and mentors in neurodiversity post 92. And now I find myself, after being a senior lecturer for about 5 or 6 years, in an academic development role. And I actually feel like I've come home. I'm very happy to be at Staffordshire, working alongside the wonderful Anshul, and so I'm here today to offer you a little bit of, I suppose, lived experience slash years worth of working with different neurodiverse students, but I'm going to focus on here today about ADHD. Obviously it's something that I'm passionate with, recognising it in myself now, but I'm also recognising it in staff as well as students, predominantly across the sector. And I just love that quote on my first slide. You know, we just love doing everything. And so obviously I was delighted that Anshul invited me in today, because this actually is a presentation that I did last week at the National Association of Disability Practitioners on a webinar about supporting ADHD students and lived experiences. So hopefully I can do it justice again. Yeah, please just stop me or pop some questions in the chat if you've got anything as I go through the slides. So just to put things in context, really, I just kind of want to go through, I know Mary was talking a little bit there about cognitive action and neuroscience in relation to how the brain works in terms of active learning. I kind of want to share my kind of knowledge, which you already might be aware of, but just for those of us perhaps maybe who are not, the brain works differently, okay, for different people. And as somebody who isn't neurotypical, my brain is wired in a slightly different way to what a neurotypical brain would look like. That really predominantly fits in with the front part of the brain. So there you've got the prefrontal cortex, and that, you know, that works in the sense of I struggle with dopamine, okay, which is obviously a chemical which stimulates and gets me interested in things and makes me want to do what I want. It's also the chemical that controls the brain's reward and pleasure centre. So if anybody's heard of the book The Chimp Paradox, my chimp is enormous. For everything I do, I want praise immediately. I need to have something tangible to hang on to. Otherwise, my motivation just sinks immensely in terms of intrinsic goal setting and doing. So that's an impairment that affects my brain and affects people with ADHD. And that frontal region really makes me focus, because it's got my attention bit towards it. It's got my executive function, and it also has my organisation. But as you can imagine, doing what I've done over the last however long in my career, the last 20 years, I've obviously developed some coping strategies for that. But if you are working with students, perhaps maybe who haven't necessarily had those experiences, or maybe have had quite negative experiences of schooling, that prefrontal cortex, you will find that obviously those predominant things or those challenges or those difficulties are going to be really, really, really kind of damaging for their self-efficacy and confidence. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, which is an interesting kind of concept, which often people don't necessarily link with ADHD, is that the limbic system regulates our kind of our emotions. We're seeing this particularly in females and girls. The literature suggests that actually, you know, when a lot of girls become emotional, they've necessarily been masking, you know, characteristics of perhaps maybe ADHD or neurodiversity. bearing in mind that a lot of these things are co kind of occurring. So if you've got ADHD, you're quite likely to have some kind of mental health or well-being issue. But I would question, well, do they? Is it just that regulation of their brain is impaired through dysfunction of the limbic system? Okay, so I don't have any literature to hand on that. I think that was just necessarily my experience, and I guess I'm critically questioning what's out there and what's happening. The next area is the basal ganglia. This is kind of a short circuit. We see this sometimes in reference to lots of children. This is the inattention or the impulsivity, and we've heard of all the the unfortunate situations with medication of children that may or may not have been correctly diagnosed with ADHD, and the medication is supposed to keep them kind of sedated because the impulsivity and the inattention is so great and they can't manage the classroom environment and the learning and teaching that goes on at their school-based education. And last but not least, is the reticular activating system, and this is the pathways that Mary was talking about in terms of neural pathways for different things, to make connections and actually create learning systems for different types of learning, whether that be the passive learning, the kind of collaborative learning, the active learning, and obviously there's some difficulties and challenges with that if your brain is wired in an ADHD way. Okay, so that's kind of I just wanted to kind of put the context out there. You've got to kind of understand how the brain works to then recognise how that we design, how we put together our curriculum, how we put together our resources, how we support people through personal tutoring or academic mentoring systems. They are all connected to the way that the brain works in general. So the first thing then I'll talk about is this prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain, and a lot of this is to do obviously with this executive functioning. There's a large aspect of cognitive load a part of as part of this, and so actually the main advice really here in terms of if you are designing, you're educating, you're teaching, you're assessing is the chunking of information. You've got to ensure that what you do is broken down into the smaller chunks. And obviously the technology that we have for those things now is incredible in comparison to maybe what we had 20 years ago. So, accessibility of documents, making sure the justification, the formatting, the text, the line spacing, the use of bullet points, the use of imagery, the chunking of different types of learning processes, so video, audio, written, lived experiences from students coming in, or patients if you're in healthcare, or business owners if you're talking about being in a faculty where you're talking about social sciences. So all of those things I think can really help ADHDers manage the information flow that comes into them. And remember, we are not information transmitters anymore. This is what I'm doing to you right now. But we're not necessarily information transmitters. We are curators. We are designers. We are facilitators. We are not necessarily the transmitters of information, because actually, you know what, Google, AI, all those other things can provide access for students to some of those elements. So it's what we do with that information, how we filter it, or how we ask our students to filter it, process it, prioritise it, and go to those higher order levels of thinking like Mary talked about on Bloom's. That is actually, well, I see that as fulfilling my role, really. There's been a lot of talk recently as well about block teaching. So you may have heard of Kevin Merry over at De Montfort. He's doing a huge amount about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and block teaching. That idea of short, intense courses to boost student success and engagement. I guess there's a question there about research design of whether that would be more empowering or more facilitating to those with ADHD diagnosis. There's also that playful aspect of learning that we touched upon in the questions about 15 minutes ago around kind of creative approaches. And I think gamification in terms of that, introducing that motivation for ADHDers to stop boredom and to avoid mundane tasks. I think all of those things actually, if you are designing a curriculum or a series or a session using those approaches, I think that can really add to the novelty value for the ADHDers and keeping them engaged and keeping them on task. The other aspect that's, I guess, less talked about, although perhaps maybe is coming more into the literature at the moment, is around belonging for ADHDers specifically, and how important it is to support them in their sense of self. So here, this comes back to the limbic system in the brain. This is about emotional security. It's about feeling safe. It's about feeling connected. And those things actually kind of limit the issues around worrying and rumination for those with ADHD. We know that inclusive coaching and mentoring approaches can help foster belonging for any student really, but predominantly there is a great literature base for adults, maybe not necessarily studying in higher education, but great literature base for adults that coaching and mentoring for ADHDers works extremely well. And you can be in a room if you're an ADHDer and you can feel as lonely as hell, even though you look connected, you looked engaged, and you kind of, you are feeling like you are contributing. So I think that the power in the words here, if you're facilitating, you're teaching, you're mentoring, you're working with a group of individuals or a group of those that are neurodiverse, is using those words, we, I and you. Okay, so including that language in the way that you do things, acknowledging that we are a group, we can solve a problem, we can co-create, we can do this as a practice assessment, we can facilitate you all to better outcomes. We will do this together as a diverse set of people in this situation. Okay, so I've got that language there already set up. Praise, so Mary was really good at the end of her session there, including the thank you, so, and the appreciation of perhaps maybe the difficulties or the challenges that students with ADHD face. So I know it's hard, I can see this is challenging for you. I hear what you're saying here. How can we support you to do this in a better way? Some of that might come through reasonable adjustments if people have obviously got an official or a formal diagnosis, but some of that actually might be that if you have a strong relationship with that student, or that student has strong relationships with their peers, it may be that actually they're happy to disclose and don't want to go through the diagnosis route. And if they're able to use the tools and the coping strategies that I'm going to share at the end of this presentation, then actually, sometimes there isn't a need for people to actually fully go through the disclosure route and fully go through an assessment. And that kind of positivity, that upbeatness of reminding people and reinforcing to people that they are valued. It's back to that sense of belonging and kind of activating that limbic system in terms of kind of acknowledging, you're on a journey here, but that explicitness of that language, that words, however it's done, is really important. It could be a buddy, it could be you as a tutor or as a staff member, or it could be setting up peer groups. The other thing that's really interesting about ADHD is obviously this prioritisation. There is challenges in indecisiveness and prioritisation of tasks. And I think when feedback is presented as part of the teaching dialogue process, or as part of a student's journey or experience through higher education, the feedback can come over personalised or kind of over, somebody might see constructive feedback actually as very negative through the lens of an ADHD. Again, that's part of the brain and the way that it's wired. And so there's a, you know, a lovely kind of way of doing that the University of Bath suggests in their good practice guide, is around point evidence and analysis. So activating those three things and focusing really on, you know, what is a memorable visual aid to be able to prompt them into developing whatever it is as part of that assessment, can be really useful. Obviously rubrics, you know, for those who, you know, in terms of executive functioning, a rubric design is very, very useful for somebody who's got ADHD, if that's very clear with student-friendly language, and it's very criteria driven, and that is very helpful because it's very easy, or it's more easy to see what the output might look like. Feed forward and in terms of SMART goals is absolutely needed because of obviously that nature of not being able to kind of see what's important. So it might be that there are loads of things that are really developmental about an assessment or a piece of assessment work, but you know, what are the top three, you know, for that student to feed forward? And it might be 3 things to carry on and 3 things to improve. Okay, because they won't tangibly be able to take in all of it at one go. So it's about how do we kind of make sure that they get the message of the most significant things in that to put forward to the next time that they do an assessment themselves. So I've touched on this already, and I think this for me, I think struck a chord, particularly having a child also in early years at the moment, around the 4 motivators. So we've already had a quick chat in the previous presentation, if you were here, about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, but motivators for ADHDers are just a little bit further down the line in terms of what are you going to, or how are you going to engage them in the task. Normally, if you think about a child and you think about a sticker chart, or you think about, you know, rewarding that chimp in what am I going to get for doing what you've asked, and we're talking about behaviorism there in terms of, you know, Pavlov dogs, it is quite a straightforward process. You do something, I'll give you something in return. Now, that's a neurotypical theoretical concept. That is not for neurodiversity, or maybe it works for some neurodiverse individuals, but it certainly doesn't work for all. And there's been a suggestion that actually those who are neurodiverse would benefit from an importance-based nervous system. So that means that people with ADHD have this interest-based nervous system, and unlike the importance priority-based nervous system, they explain that the dopamine, which is that chemical that kind of goes around you, is released only when the brain senses one of the 4 criteria as an ADHDer. So how do you introduce novelty? That's the first one. So it could be as simple as I'm teaching a group of students and I add in some really smelly board pens to do an activity, something just a little bit different. You know, maybe it's new sticky notes, maybe it's a new creative technique to write and share dialogue that they're having in groups, but something new to sort of engage them in the activity can be really, really helpful to get them motivated and get them in the zone. In terms of urgency, I would strongly advise visual timers. So that could be kind of an online stopwatch. It could be anything from, you know, a sand timer, but those types of things are actually really good. To grab people's interest, storytelling, gamification, new digital apps, escape rooms, competitions, quizzes, lots of different things there to capture their interest. And challenge, you know, can you give prizes? Can you do things in groups? You know, there are lots of options to kind of stretch and challenge, you know, people so that they feel like they're always getting the dopamine that they need to be activated for more learning. And the other thing that's quite helpful to recognise is self-determination theory. Okay, so that's a psychological perspective on what intrinsically motivates people to do things to their highest potential. And that at the moment is being heavily researched in terms of ADHD, because what they're saying is that this obviously overlaps on the work with belonging. Belonging supports motivation, and so therefore, as a cycle, this could really, really help our understanding of how ADHD is learned. We've also got there, obviously, time. Things kind of related to time, but what we really need to talk about is not the words focus or you've only got a certain amount of time for this. It's rather about the perception or the notion of how much have you got for the task. So if you can use the word task rather than time, you know, people say, oh, I've got poor time management. But actually, if you've got a brain that's wired not to do that, then actually that's quite it's quite detrimental really to your self-efficacy and your confidence in terms of saying, oh, you're not very good at time management, you need to do a course on time management, you need to go and get help for time management. So I've got a slide there about, you know, metacognition. So in any support strategies that you kind of facilitate for students, you know, think about the metacognition, the reinforcement and the learning how to learn, I think is really, really supportive of individuals with ADHD. There are some great tools, so hopefully my slides will be able to be shared, but there's an adult ADHD network. They've got a lovely set of apps for ADHDers which you could integrate into your teaching practice or share with your students. A to-do list, which is a worksheet that enables people to prioritise the top 3 things. I've already talked about visual timers, but obviously there's a forest app as well, and that's a lovely thing that students can put on their phone, and they can do it per task, so it's not time related, it's per task, and to keep on task and keep focused, the tree grows as you do the task, and if you stop the task, the tree dies. So it's a very visual sort of metaphor reminder of how to keep going and sort of motivating people to be engaged. And finally, obviously, I think I've already seen this in the chat when I first started talking, somebody posted it in. Yeah, I think the principles of this just kind of echo anything that you're doing with the ADHDers. So, you know, that active lessons, whether that's walking around the learning space outdoors or engagement with digital pedagogies, the incorporation of personal interests for expression, representation and engagement, you know, TV, books, out of school interests, all of those things are really helpful to keep the novelty and the interest value going for students. Creative artifacts, you know, anything that's hands-on is really really helpful, and anything to track progress in terms of executive functions, so calendars, step charts, checklists, and music is really good too. So here's just a quick kind of, if you were to do something UDL, how would you provide alternatives to an oral presentation? It might be that somebody has social anxiety or feels that actually they wouldn't be able to keep to time. Look at me right now, I'm a prime example of that, but you could offer these solutions. They could all meet the learning outcomes if you know, if it was about delivery or if it was about particular aspects or concepts that you were designing in, but it would be a different way of articulating those in a different format for the student to take choice in how they delivered those. Okay. And they, you know, like I said, predominantly that obviously meets some challenges for the teacher in terms of the rubric design, in terms of how they put the assessment together. However, you know, I'm always up for a challenge, and I think, you know, we've got some good ways of doing that now.